If some people ended up on an uninhabited island due to some mishap, traveling, the boat gets lost or what have you, and they end up on this uninhabited island and they don't have any communication to anyone else, and so they don't know how long they're going to be there. The common way to handle that situation, the common rational and ethical way to handle a situation would be to explore the island, see what food and fresh water there is, because that's what's needed for survival. And anything that's already pre existing there on the island should be shared evenly among their survivors, right? So that's actually the same exact situation that we're all in on an ethical level, even though we just weren't on a cruise that got lost and landed on an uninhabited island. Just being born on the earth is actually on an ethical level the same thing. And yet we've been born into a world, into a society where having to pay just to have the basic necessities, just to have a little piece of land, just to have some water, have some seed, for vegetable garden, fruit trees, nut trees. We're born into a society where you have to pay for the so-called privilege of just existing on the planet Earth. And I'm not saying it's not a privilege to be born on the Earth. What I'm saying is it shouldn't actually be considered a privilege to be given or taken away by other people, depending on whether you pay them or not. It shouldn't be considered a privilege just to be able to survive on the planet and not be exploited, oppressed, and abused by other people who are withholding your birthright and saying that you have to pay them for it. The majority of people are living paycheck to paycheck, right? Meaning they have just enough to get by, but not much more, right? Little to no savings. And it's just basically a constant struggle and need to be earning more income to cover basic expenses. And at the top of the list of these expenses is a place to live. So remember that we are humans on the planet Earth. Think of the uninhabited island scenario again for a moment and recognize, big picture, zoom out, like you're looking at the Earth from outer space. It's a bunch of humans on a planet, right? Planet Earth. And those humans need to have a little bit of space on that planet, a little land. And for survival, they need water and they need food. And the means to grow that food are pre-existing in nature. The seed is already available. The design, the biology, the amazing science of plant life is already pre-existing, already ready to go, already operating and available, right? When you bite into the fruit, you discover the seed inside, and you can just plant that seed into the ground, create a whole new fruit tree that will produce, thousands of more fruits over its lifetime, right? All for free, all pre-existing, provided by, I would say, God, but if you don't believe in a creator, you could just say provided by nature, provided by the universe. It's pre-existing, not created by man, and it supports our survival, right? So, getting back to the paycheck to paycheck reality, the number one expense is rent or a mortgage, right? That's the number one expense for most people, right? So, in the uninhabited island scenario, that would not be an expense, right? Because it wouldn't make sense for anyone that just landed on the island to become the owner or landlord of the entire island and then say, hey, if you want to stay on the island, you got to start, working for me or paying me, in precious stones that you got to go search out and collect or whatever. You got to pay me, you got to work for me, and then I will bestow upon you the privilege of being able to just live, on the planet, being able to survive, being able to just have a little space to yourself, have a little autonomy, have a little freedom. You have to work for me in order to realize those privileges that I'm gracing upon you, if you work for me as you should. So what this has to do with just human life in a religious context is that we're often told to interpret the saying, you can't worship both God and mammon, mammon being, an old word for money and wealth. You can't serve both God and wealth. We're told to interpret that as, oh, that means just, don't become a money hungry miser, craving more and more, never satisfied. Don't become this materialist, because the best things in life are actually of a spiritual nature, of a, energetic and ethical nature. And the latter part of that is true. The ultimate satisfaction that we can attain is definitely via the religious, or you could say spiritual route, through relationship with the divine, through right relationship with the divine. That is true. However, the way they propagandistically communicate their perspective on it is that any sort of desire for wealth is wrong in and of itself. That basically, it'd be better to take like a vow of poverty than it would be to be pursuing or desiring any kind of wealth. So the deception there, I would say, is in misinterpreting or, skewing, twisting the meaning of the word serve. So if you just want to have some space to yourself and you'd like to have a vegetable garden and some fresh water, that isn't serving wealth, right? That doesn't mean you're necessarily like a money hungry, super materialist who doesn't care about divinity, right? The reality is we're actually all put in a position, we're coerced into serving money by being denied our free natural birthrights, right? What should be free is not. And so we are then put into a position of servitude to money. So actually, the truth about not serving God and wealth is that if you're forced to serve wealth, then that undermines your ability to serve God. I mean, just think of commonplace reality, commonplace commentary on people talking about, their soul draining job and how they wish they could pursue their God-given talents and gifts and, do all these wonderful creative things, but they just don't have the time or the energy because they have to earn a paycheck. And the main reason they have to earn the paycheck is because they have to pay just to live on the planet, right? They have to pay the rent, the mortgage, and the property tax, right? They have to pay for the water. They have to pay for these basics that, again, are pre-existing in nature and no man created and are needed for survival. So they're put in a position where they are having to devote so much of their time and energy and focus to the I was going to say accumulation, but when you're living paycheck to paycheck, you're not really accumulating money. You're just getting enough to pay the bills and then, repeat over and over again. I just find it completely ridiculous whenever I read an article or a book or hear a presentation on poverty and they don't talk about land and water access. Like the thing that would actually help people the most in reducing poverty, again, because it's the number one expense, right? This is pretty basic reasoning here, right? If you remove the number one expense from humanity, then poverty will surely decrease, right? I think that's straightforward. And yet, land and water being recognized as a birthright is never, from what I see and from what I hear, almost never discussed, never comes up. So, like the obvious solution, what would obviously help the most, is never talked about at all. And so things never really get any better. Or if the so-called quality of life increases, it's at the expense of losing more and more freedom, right? You could point to, I guess, some European nations as a supposed ideal, but then also look at how heavily they're taxed, right? And how heavily they're regulated and how heavily they're controlled, right? So, yes, they might have these basics covered, but they're completely caught into a system that won't let them go, right? Jesus said he came to give us a more abundant life. He said he came to preach good news to the poor. He said he came to set the captives free. And yet somehow all of those messages are supposed to fit into a society wherein you're not actually free and you're kept into a state of poverty because of being denied your birthrights, which undermine any level of abundance that most people could ever have, no matter how hard they work, right? And what's called like the prosperity gospel is just demonized as, this, ultra materialist, just anti-God kind of thing. And I'm not saying that some folks talking about money and wealth aren't, idolizing it, but it's not one or the other. You can actually recognize, well, if you don't have anything, or if you're struggling always just to get by, that is undermining your ability to realize your full potential. You're not actually able to serve God and devote yourself to God to the full extent that you would be if you didn't have the constant distraction and energy drain and time drain of having to look for a job somewhere and pay just to be able to live on the planet. And the idea that it's a privilege, like, what is that about, really? Does that actually make any sense whatsoever? So, in the scenario that I gave previously of, if a bunch of people, they're all just tourists or whatever, they land on an uninhabited island, it would make sense that they should share the food and water that's pre-existing there. Most people wouldn't argue against that. But they'll say, oh, well, it's different because now you're born into a world where the land has been already purchased, right? And you're born into whatever state, you happen to be born into, right? The whole earth is one state bordering another, right? So you're automatically born into a state, you're automatically born into a society where there isn't any land and water set aside for you free of charge. It's now a commodity that you have to pay for. So to make it a little more clear to you of if you think that somehow like this modern civilization society distortion of that uninhabited island scenario, if you think somehow it's legit, let's go back to the island for a moment and imagine that when the group that got lost landed there was actually one guy already on the island. And he was previously part of a group that had also gotten lost and landed there. But this guy happened to be a boat maker. He was skilled in making boats and large ones at that, right? So after some time, he made a deal with the other members of the island there, the other inhabitants, and said, well, if you give me, your parcel of land, because they had all, divided the island equally amongst themselves so that everyone had their own space and freedom and autonomy and privacy. And just because that, it's the right thing to do. He said, well, if you'll write me these like land titles, if you'll make up some deeds to these, parcels that you've been using and sign them over to me, I'll build you a boat so that you can leave the island, and get back to wherever you want to go. And so they decided they wanted to do that. And so the guy worked really hard on this boat for like, I don't know, say 6 months. He finally finishes the boat, did a great job. All the people thank him. They give them the little titles that they had written out, and they head off on the boat, and that's it, right? So now the guy's just at the island chilling with his titles or deeds or whatever, anticipating that some other people might come around. And then they do. And so when they arrive, he says, yeah, I understand, that normally you would think that you'd have like access to these coconuts on the coconut tree, or the fresh water in the lake over there. But and then he explains what happened with the previous inhabitants. So that's closer to the world we're born into, right? That's closer to like modern day civilization, right? It's a kind of simplistic version of it, right? So is that now legit? Is that one guy on the island right in saying, well, I actually, bought or earned all of these other parcels. And so now you all have to work for me. And I've actually, come up with some ideas on what I'd like people to do for me, while I was sitting here by myself. I'd like some massage therapists, I'd like some people to, help me with my boat making. And, I got various other ideas on things you can do around the island for me. And, I'll pay you an hour, a certain amount of wages. And, eventually, maybe after a few years of work, you might be able to afford to, buy a little parcel for yourself there. Would that be legitimate? You know, he did work. He did work for those titles, right? He did work for those deeds, right? He built that big boat, right? No, even though he put in some sweat equity, he doesn't actually have the right to then impose his will and control over those new inhabitants, those new survivors that landed on the island. And why is that? Well, the answer is super simple. And yet, again, I don't hear anyone saying so. I don't hear anyone vocalizing or writing this simple truth, which is that homesteading land and water are free birthrights, right? Just like how we have unalienable rights given by God, right? The right to not be abused is an unalienable right. Well, it goes hand in hand with that, because if you're born on a planet where you need some space and land and water in order to survive, and other people are telling you that you got to pay them or work for them in order to have access to that, that's actually abusive. That's actually a fundamental violation. It's a violation of your fundamental right, which is the right to not be abused. All of these other sub rights kind of that come from that, you might be more familiar with, like the right to freely practice your religion, the right to free speech, the right to assemble, right? But all of those are just examples of not being abused in various different ways, right? If someone is restricting you this way or controlling you that way, it's all just different kinds of abuse. So fundamentally, it's just a right to not be abused, which actually corresponds with the true divine law, which was expressed by Jesus, which is the greatest commandments. And the opposite of the befriending, loving action towards God, others, and yourself that he was talking about is abuse. So it's a simultaneous law for for love and against abuse, right? But it seems people will just accept this fundamental injustice as if it's somehow legit. But again, it's not. If you actually think about it, if you actually analyze it, it's not actually legit to have to pay others, obey others, just to have a place on the planet, right? Who are they to grant you the so-called privilege of just surviving on planet Earth that you were born on? Right? That's abusive. That's it. It's as simple as that. I don't know why it's so hard to see. So we have most people struggling just to get by. We have them not able to exercise and realize their full potential creatively, spiritually, religiously, socially, across the board. They're having to conform to the demands of wherever they can earn money. And it's common knowledge, or it's fairly common knowledge, or it's common among those that are very wealthy, that the goal is to get, they say, money to work for you, and so you're no longer working for money, right? So they're not serving mammon, right? They're having mammon, you could say, serve them or work for them, right? After you gain a certain amount of wealth, monetary wealth in particular, right? It can just gain interest, or you get certain assets and they just gain in value. So you're not having to work for the money and the wealth and the assets are working for you, right? So even though you'll hear people, giving kind of like advice on finances and, economy, saying that that's the goal, you want to get to the point where money's working for you and you're not working for money. As far as I've seen, there's been no recognition of the connection between that and what Jesus said, which is that we're to serve God and not wealth, or that you can't serve both God and wealth. Well, if that's true, and I believe it is, then obviously you would want to serve God and not wealth. And if the way to not serve wealth is to have wealth serve you, that means that you have a certain amount of it already, so you're not in a position where you're having to serve it, right? If you already have the basics and they're secure and they're not depreciating in value and they're continually providing for you, then you're no longer in a position of servitude to that wealth, right? So you can then put your focus on the most important thing, namely God, right? Or if you don't believe in God, you could say, realizing your full potential, being your best self, exercising your creative passions to the fullest, right? Being of most service, all these kind of things, living your best life. All of which is undermined when you're having to pay just to live on the planet, which is a fundamental abuse. It's a denial of your birthright. And a lot of people reference a lot of Christians reference the so-called Apostle Paul over referencing Jesus once again, and his famous statement that the love of money is the root of all evil. It's just slyly propagandistic and deceptive and diverting away from what the real truth is, right? Because Jesus told us what the ultimate good is, right? Which is comprehensive love, and the opposite of that is abuse. If the root of all evil was really money, don't you think Jesus would have said so? It's just like the main tenet, or the main teaching of mainstream Pauline Christianity is that the reason that Jesus accepted the crucifixion was because it was a blood payment that paid for all your sins, and so it doesn't matter if you keep sinning or not. As long as you say a certain prayer and have the right level of belief, you'll be accepted into heaven. Interesting how Jesus never actually said that, right? And yet it's made it the central, core of Christianity. So likewise, back to this issue of money and wealth, this statement of Paul that the love of money is the root of all evil is highlighted. But again, the root of all evil is actually abuse, or abuse is what the real evil is, you could say. And, believing lies, you could say, is the root of why people become abusive, or why we believe abuse is actually good. But any way you look at it, the teaching that the love of money is the root of all evil is just another way of pushing that false interpretation of you can't serve both God and mammon, and pushing this like anti-prosperity gospel that really is just keeping people disempowered and keeping them in an unnecessary struggle that shouldn't be if we actually had true social justice going on. And, some folks doing a good job trying to help deprogram people from what we've been indoctrinated with. We'll talk about, like limiting beliefs with money, right? And the belief that money is evil is a very common one, along with believing that if you're wealthy, you're a bad person, or that you can't be religious and also, have a decent amount of wealth, right? Going back to that misinterpretation of you can't serve both God and wealth. It all just serves the purpose of keeping people drained mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Which reminds me of a quote by a former president of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt. I'll pull up this quote for you. He said, "People who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made," end quote. Now, don't take this as an endorsement of Franklin Roosevelt's, other views and activities and politics and all that. It's not. It's just, I agree with that. Those particular words I agree with. And that's also clearly part of why the powers that be would want to undermine people's prosperity and freedom from the start by denying their birthright to just live on the planet and survive on the planet freely, because that puts them in a position to more easily control a population, right? If everyone's just struggling to get by, they're all disempowered and tired and, just constantly focused on work and having to, break up and it's constantly breaking up families and communities as people go searching for jobs or taking jobs wherever they can find them, right? A fragmented, disempowered population having to serve mammon serves a satanic system. There's a lot more I could say just about how being denied our birthright takes away from how great life could be. Just on the nature front, we often, don't even know about the wildlife, plants, etc. In our area because we don't have the time really to gain that knowledge, and gain even relationship with the land and the nature around us. We can have wildflowers growing in our front yard and not even, know what they are, know what medicinal purposes they have, and, can have wonderful wildlife and natural places around that we just really can't experience or appreciate, except for on a short vacation. We've been disconnected from the earth, disconnected from nature, and actually largely disconnected from the religious life, I would say, by this coerced situation, this unjust restriction, this unjust abuse that puts us in a position where we're constantly having to serve mammon. And as Jesus said, we can't serve both God and mammon. So I hope this made some sense to you and that you'll take a trip back in your imagination to the uninhabited island scenarios and realize, especially that second scenario with the boat maker, I hope you'll realize that that really is a fair, simplified version of the world we're born into and a fair explanation of why these pre-existing survival necessities of homesteading, land, water, and seed should be considered cost and tax-free birthrights for all, and how that would be the greatest help for alleviating poverty, and I'd say probably also depression as well, and anxiety and all the rest that comes with having to conform with an unjust economic system that's based on abuse. Sovereign veganic homesteads, voluntary communities of sovereign veganic homesteads. That's the answer, not some social system, that's basically communist in nature and basically oppressive and abusive. We need to get back to basic ethics and recognizing each other as sovereign humans on the planet. A planet we didn't create, nature we didn't design, right? And treat each other fairly on that fundamental level. That would be true social justice as opposed to what all the crazy, cultural Marxist rantings on social justice are that we hear nowadays. All right, thanks for listening.